Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. By Tandem Diabetes Care, makers of the t:slim X2 insulin pump. And by Real Good Foods, real food you feel good about eating.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, all about using a CGM to the best of its ability. To help us out, I asked certified diabetes educator Gary Scheiner to come on. He lives with type 1. He's used every continuous glucose monitor that is out there. And he says not only is the hardware different, but the displays are too.
Some have diagonal arrows, some have single up and down, some have double, some have triple, and they all mean different things. So you have to consider how your system interprets those arrows.
Gary heads up Integrative Diabetes Services, where he, among other things, trains his clients to use pumps and CGMs, and he's the author of Think Like A Pancreas, among many other books. In our community connection this week, Diabetes Camp for Grownups. Why should the kids have all the fun? A look at some of the programs available. And Tell Me Something Good. Some diabetes camp memories more than a generation later. And a big award for a kid who doesn't have type 1, but supports her friends who do. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome back to another week of Diabetes Connections. I'm your host, Stacey Sims. So glad to have you along. Now, this is an extra type of episode, which means the whole long, uncut interview will run all by itself in a bonus episode later this week. My interview with Gary Scheiner that you're going to hear today is basically an excerpt where we hit a lot of the high spots and give some basic information, but the whole extra episode will be available in just a couple of days. I have to say a big thank you to the listeners who came to Touched by Type 1, the conference that was held recently in Orlando that I was lucky enough to go to. This was my second time. I'm actually going to talk more about this in Tell Me Something Good. I have some shout outs to some great people who stopped by. We had a lot of fun. And not only is that conference growing by leaps and bounds, I got to tell you, I'm really getting a kick out of meeting so many more of you. I think as the podcast is growing and, we're reaching more people are coming out to say hi. So it was really fun. And I hope I get to meet more of you. If you'd like me to come speak in your neck of the woods, just drop me a line, Stacey@diabetes-connections.com, or jump in the Facebook group or social media. You can pretty much find me anywhere. I do want to mention, we're talking about camp a little bit this episode after we have the CGM conversation, camp for grownups. And there's a little bit of camp later in Tell Me Something Good. This morning, I was filling out the diabetes camp forms. Now, I was supposed to do this a couple of weeks ago, and I missed one page. I'm not sure how that happened, but there was just one page that I missed. So I had to fill that out. And it was the spot. It included that place where it says, do you have any goals for your child? This is where you write down the concrete diabetes management stuff that you want them to work on. And as I've mentioned before, my son Benny, who was diagnosed right before he turned 2, he is now 14, he started going to Sleepaway Diabetes Camp when he was 7. So he's been going for this 1 week for a very long time. And every year, I've written basically the same thing on this diabetes management goal. Some parents write, give their own shots, or learn how to carb count, or check blood sugar. Every year I have written, work on inserting own sites. And it was always pump sites for a long time, and then it was Dexcom sites. But this year, I realized I don't have anything to write. I really was stumped because he does it all himself. Now, if you're one of his counselors, or maybe my CDE is listening, you are laughing because you told me this would happen. But I have to admit, I really doubted it. Benny spent so much time running away from us. If you've got a little kid, maybe this happens to you, he would hide. He was terrified of pump insets for a very long time. First, we called it, giving a hug. We'd give him a really big hug and then pop it on him. And he was always fine afterward. I think it was much more the anticipation, but it was never bad after it went on. But it just took so much time to put those insets on when he was little. And then as he got older, he would kind of have to psych himself up to do it. And he started doing insets really a couple of years ago. But he still would have to take time, steel himself, here it comes, deep breaths. And now I just watch him, the Dexcom G6 has made things a lot easier. It's not that kind of long-looking needle inserter torture device thingy. He can do it himself with one hand, which he really likes. But I think psychologically he's come a long way too. And I just watch him. And I've shared this before. Sometimes I watch him put his inset on or do a shot or put his Dexcom on. And I get emotional. And I say, oh, I'm so proud of you. And he looks at me and he's like, Mom, how embarrassing. But also I think he doesn't remember, which gives me a lot of comfort. So just filling out that form or leaving that blank was emotional for me. So if you're a parent of a little one, it will get better. I know it's really tough. And there's a lot you can do. There, if you want to reach out, or we can have this conversation in the Facebook group, there's a lot you can do to make it better. One of Benny's favorite things was we would hold him upside down. And then we would do it because it was so distracting. We can't do that now. He is much bigger than I am, and he's almost as big as my husband. But Benny jokes around sometimes about still doing that. Oh, my goodness. And if you are an adult with type 1, these things are tough to do no matter how old you are. So, man, a lot of respect. Okay, much more on using the CGM, not just inserting it, in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And, we started with Dexcom back in the olden days, as I like to call them, before Share. So, trust me when I say using the Share and Follow apps makes a big difference. Benny and I set parameters about when I'm going to call him, how long to wait, that kind of stuff. It really helps us talk and worry about diabetes less. And if he's at a sleepover or away on a trip, it gives me so much peace of mind. It also helps if I need to troubleshoot with him because we can see what's been happening over the last 24 hours and not just at one moment. The alerts and alarms that we set help us from keeping those highs from getting too high and help us jump on lows before they're a big issue. Internet connectivity is required to access the separate Dexcom Follow app. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. My guest this week is an award-winning certified diabetes educator, master's level exercise physiologist, and has lived with type 1 since 1985. He's been on the show before. Gary Scheiner was named 2014 Diabetes Educator of the Year by the American Association of Diabetes Educators. He's authored 6 books, including Think Like a Pancreas, The Ultimate Guide to Accurate Carb Counting, and Until There's a Cure, among others. Gary's certified to train on all models of insulin pumps and CGM systems, and he's worn them all. Just after our interview, he received the Eversense implantable CGM, and he will talk about that with me as well. Again, this is a Diabetes Connections extra, so this is an excerpt, and the full interview will run later this week in a bonus episode. Here's my talk with Gary Scheiner. Gary, thank you so much for talking to me about this. When I wanted to talk CGM, I thought, who do I know who's worn just about every single one of them, who has patients who've worn every single one of them, and really has this expertise. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure, Stacey. I'm a human guinea pig.
Well, I think when you're talking about these different types of diabetes technologies, if you haven't worn it or experienced it, it's really difficult to understand it. My son's used a Dexcom since 2013, and I can't say I understand it as well as he has, certainly, but it's hard to explain to people who don't wear them. So let's just jump right in and kind of set the parameters here. I don't want to do a comparison of what's best because it's very individual, unless you want to jump on in and give us the skinny on the A+ CGM.
The systems each have their share of pros and cons. I would say, from an accuracy standpoint, the implantable sensor is probably has the best accuracy, but it has to be surgically implanted and it has to be calibrated a couple of times a day. But the Dexcom G6 is very close in terms of accuracy with, no calibrations at all, followed by, the Libre and the Medtronic. I'm still waiting for, Medtronic to launch a really state-of-the-art effective sensor. Hopefully the next generation systems will prove better than the ones they've had in the past.
Well, I'll refer people to several articles you've written, and we'll link those up, comparing them kind of side by side. But I'd really like to focus on whatever you use, and maybe we'll go through them type by type, but whatever you use, how to get the most out of it, some tips and tricks so that people can really get the best out of the devices that they're using. Why don't we start with Medtronic? Because, and I don't use that system, I'm not as familiar with it, but take us through what's there because they have a standalone CGM, but my understanding, could be wrong, my understanding is that for the most part, people use it with a pump.
Yeah, most people who are using the Medtronic sensor, and I would say 99.9% using Medtronic sensors are using it with the 670 or 630 G pumps that have the kind of the hybrid closed loop technologies. So the pump will make some decisions on its own regarding the insulin delivery based on the information that the sensor is feeding into it. If there's anybody who wants to get better diabetes control and better quality of life out of the sensor, I think the same principles apply no matter what system they're using. I mean, there's a few subtle differences regarding, calibration and how the sensor's inserted, et cetera. But there's some basic things. And I'll start out with, well, first off, the three things that CGMs can give us in real time are numbers, trending information, and high-low alerts. So I think it's worth discussing those one at a time, starting with the numbers themselves. And it's interesting, going back a decade or so, we just didn't trust the numbers on CGM the way we do now. In fact, just a couple of years ago, the T1D Exchange did a survey of CGM users and asked them how many of them are using the CGM numbers for determining their insulin doses. And this was long before the FDA approved the systems as a replacement for finger sticks. But even years ago, more than 80% of people were using the CGM for dosing.
Wow.
I think the key is that you're smart about it and know when it's reliable for dosing and when it's not. And there are a lot of scenarios or situations where the CGM is not going to provide you with a reliable data point for determining an insulin dose. And I'll ask you, Stacey, since you have some experience using them with your son, can you think of a situation where you're going to need to resort to a finger stick?
Oh, sure. The first one that comes to mind is during a rapid drop. If it's showing me something like that after exercise, perhaps, or just kind of out of the blue, but if it's going very quickly.
Absolutely. And that's attributable to the lag time. When you have a 5 to 10 minute lag time and the blood sugar is changing very rapidly, your sensor, if it's rising, your sensor is going to underestimate your blood sugar almost all the time. And when it's falling, it's going to overestimate your blood sugar almost all the time. So if there are straight up, straight down, or double up, double down arrows on screen, it's preferential to do a finger stick to get a more precise number for dosing purposes. With the G6 or with any CGM that doesn't require calibration, are there times when it does not give you data?
Sure, when he'll lose signal, or with the share, when I'll lose signal. But there are times when he's swimming, right? He's in the water, or he's in the shower, or he's laying on the sensor in a funky way, and you don't get those numbers.
And I would add to that warm-up periods, which the warm-up periods are a couple of hours with most systems. With the Eversense, it's a 12-hour warm-up. But during warm-up periods, you're still going to need to finger stick to have any data. And most people find that on day one of a sensor, the accuracy is generally not as good as it's going to get. G6 is not too bad. The day one accuracy with G6 is decent. With every other sensor, the day one accuracy lags far behind what they're going to get on day two and beyond. So it's generally a good idea to finger stick on day one, at least the first day you have a sensor on, just to make sure things are dosed correctly. Acetaminophen is another thing that affects some systems, not all. The Medtronic, the Dexcom G4, G5, those systems are affected by any kind of Tylenol products. It's amazing how many over-the-counter cough and cold medicines contain acetaminophen.
Oh, yeah.
And if you take that acetaminophen, your glucose is going to run higher. It's going to appear higher than it really is on the sensor for a while. So that's another time that finger sticks will be necessary.
You mentioned Medtronic and acetaminophen. I just want to make sure that doesn't go by too quickly, because I had not heard that. I thought it was only Dexcom.
No, Medtronic sensors as well. If your son has a low blood sugar, after he's treated it, does the CGM show that his glucose comes up right away?
It does not. It does not.
There.
Yeah.
That's the case with every CGM.
Yeah.
There is an extended lag time when we recover from low blood sugar. So if we trust the sensor and it keeps reading low, 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 you're just going to eat and wind up over-treating. And we don't need any help over-treating our lows. We're hungry enough to do that ourselves.
So perfect example of that perfect storm was just yesterday. Benny had a sensor change. So we had 2 hours of no blood sugar numbers, and about 20 minutes before the warm-up ended, he said, "I feel low." I said, "Well, we've only got 20 minutes." He said, "No, I feel low. I'm going to check." And he checked, and he was 70, and he said, "I feel lower than that. I'm going to treat." And he treated, and as soon as the warm-up period ended, of course, it started screaming at us that he was low. 5 minutes later, we did another finger stick. He was already 84 or 85 and coming up. Yeah. But the Dexcom share kept screaming low. And it's not just in my house. My mom gets those alerts. So I had to text Grandma and say, it's fine. Dexcom is bananas. It'll catch up. Don't worry. It was a long low. Gary had like 20 carbs, I think, of juice. And it took him about an hour to float up to 120. And then he went to bed and he was like 90 all night. So it was a crazy low.
Be careful how you phrase it. It took him probably 15 minutes to come up to 120. It took the Dexcom to recognize the rise.
Proving your point.
What happened. Yeah. The Dexcom will sometimes take 30 to 60 minutes to capture the rise in blood sugar. And the reason is basically that the sensor is sitting just below the skin. It's not measuring the blood vessels or the bloodstream directly. And it takes quite a while for blood flow to be restored to the skin surface when a low blood sugar occurs. You know, our bodies go into a stress response with a low, and there's very little blood flow getting to the skin surface, and hence the sensor's not catching the fact that there's more glucose in the bloodstream. So it's necessary to do finger sticks when you're recovering from a low to prevent overtreatment. Also, anytime symptoms don't match, like what's happening with your son, if the sensor is saying you're high and you don't feel high, or it says you're low and you don't feel low, certainly it's best to finger stick and verify what's going on. So it's still, finger sticks are still part of the game, even with a non-calibrating system like a Dexcom or a Libre. And as far as calibration goes, another thing that's important to make sure the system operates properly is that if you do finger stick and see a discrepancy of more than 20%, it is a good idea to finger stick. Calibrate. Enter that reading as a calibration. Otherwise, the CGM is going to continue to underperform. If it's drifted out of range and is running higher or lower than the actual glucose, if you don't calibrate it, it's never going to get back on track. So it is necessary to calibrate when it's not running accurately.
Right back to Gary in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneTouch. For 7 years, OneTouch Vario test strips have delivered reliable results you can count on and trust. And did you know they have the lowest copay on the most health plans? And they're always covered on traditional Medicare Part B. To upgrade today to the OneTouch Vario Flex meter, visit diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneTouch logo. Coverage and payment may be subject to coinsurance, deductible, and patient eligibility requirements. LifeScan does not guarantee coverage or payment. Now back to my talk with Gary. Can you tell us how to calibrate accurately? Because I think there is some confusion there too.
Yeah, well, it's very important to use a meter that's accurate. You know, I'm a fan of the Contour Next meter. I feel that's the most accurate one on the market. You know, make sure your finger's clean when you check and you enter the reading right away. You can calibrate the Dexcom just by going into settings and entering a calibration. That's pretty simple to do. I think, a downside to the Libre is that it cannot be calibrated. So if it's not performing properly, if it's running higher or lower than your actual blood sugar, there's no way to fix it. At least with Dexcom, with the G6, you can enter a calibration. But as I said, it's not necessary to enter calibrations unless you have a reading that's more than 20% off from what the sensor is showing. Second thing would be the high and low alerts. This, to me, is the major selling point of CGM and is still extremely important for anybody who takes insulin who's at risk of hypoglycemia. Most people with diabetes do a pretty poor job of guessing what their blood sugar is. And most people don't recognize their lows or their highs until they get to a fairly extreme state. For example, I can't tell when my blood sugar is low until it gets down close to 50. And there are people who can't even tell in the 50s when they're low. And hardly anybody can tell when their glucose is just a little bit high. You know, if you're 180, it doesn't feel any different than 80 does. So the CGM is very good at picking up on those subtle highs or subtle lows so that you can treat them before they become extreme. So the critical aspects of this, number one, is putting the settings in properly, and number two, responding properly. So I'll talk about the settings first. because of the lag time, it's not reasonable to put the low alert at 70. If the sensor thinks you've gone below 70 and your blood sugar is falling, you're probably around 50 already. So it's necessary to put the low alert for most people somewhere between 80 and 90. And just to be able to catch it while it's still treatable, and you may still be able to prevent the low. At the high end, I take a little different approach. I think it's fine to start with a very high setting. I mean, put it at 300 if you want. I don't want people getting too many nuisance alarms when they start using the system, but eventually pare that high alert down to a point where you're catching it at your highest allowable post-meal blood sugar. So if you don't want to go above, say, 200 after meals, that would be a reasonable place to put your high alert eventually. And then the next aspect of it is response to the alerts. It's sort of like that tree falls in the forest and no one hears it thing. What's the difference? It's the same thing with these alerts. If you get a high or low alert and don't react to it, it's meaningless. And what I have to teach people is that when they get these alerts, they can't think. They have to just act. With any high alert, it's a good idea to enter that reading into your pump and bolus if the pump says to. If you're on injections, calculate a correction dose, but also figure out how much insulin on board you have and deduct that. But for any high alert, give yourself extra insulin if needed. It's also, worthwhile to drink some water, maybe get a little bit of physical activity. And with a low alert, it's very simple. You have to take rapid-acting carbs to reverse that downward trend and get your blood sugar back up. If you do that quickly and consistently, I guarantee you'll spend a lot more time within your target blood sugar zone. And then the third element of your daily data are the trending arrows, the up and down arrows that you see on screen. So take an example with your son. If he's going into dinner with a blood sugar of 150 and he's going to eat 60 grams of carb, you can calculate the dose he needs for that. But what if you knew that his blood sugar was 150 and falling quickly? Would that change the dose that he's likely to need?
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely. And the same thing, if he's rising quickly, it's going to change the dose that's needed. And, the trend arrows allow us to make better decisions. And we probably make an average of 40 decisions a day about things related to our blood sugar. Everything from our insulin doses to what we eat, when we eat, physical activity, etc. Just to make our lives better and safer, to help us make better decisions, we should be looking for those trend arrows pretty often. I teach my patients that for every upward arrow, if their glucose is rising, let's say 1 to 2 points per minute, they should probably dose for an extra 25 to 30 points on their blood sugar. So assume their glucose is 25 to 30 points higher than it actually is and dose for that. And with double up arrows, they should figure they're about 50 to 60 points higher than they actually are and dose for that. And with down arrows, they should assume their glucose is actually lower than it is. If they're dropping 1 to 2 points per minute, knock off 25 to 30 points from the actual glucose that they have. And with double down arrows, knock off 50 to 60 points when determining the dose to give. That improves the chances you'll be on target the next time you check.
Are the arrow speeds and those calculations consistent brand to brand? In other words, okay.
They're not. And that is such a frustrating thing. I just finished writing my next edition of Think Like a Pancreas, and I put a section in there on how to make adjustments for trend arrows. And I had to do the research on how, the exact nomenclature for every system. And it is different for every CGM on the market. Some have diagonal arrows, some have single up and down, some have double, some have triple, and they all mean different things. So you have to consider how your system interprets those arrows. That's why I say a 1 to 2 point rise, a 2 to 3 point rise, etc., rather than just saying 1 arrow, 2 arrows. If it's a Dexcom, which is probably the most popular and commonly used, I would treat each arrow as 25 points. So if you have a diagonal up arrow, add 25. If you have a straight up arrow, add 50. If you have a double up arrows, add 75 to your current glucose. And if they're down arrows, deduct 25 or 50 or 75.
Let me ask you some hardware type questions. One of the things that I've seen passed around a lot lately is insertion technique. I'll be honest with you. My son, who's 14, he grabs the G6, he slaps it on his arm, he pushes the button, he's done. Are there actual insertion techniques with different CGMs that will help you get better outcomes?
Well, the fewer steps that the user has to perform, the less chance for human error. And given, with the G6 and Libre, they're extremely easy to do.
That's right. Same
There's
with Libre.
not a whole lot that we can muck up. So it's the kind of thing that, a kid can do it. An adult who's visually impaired can do it. People with bad dexterity or a tremor can do it. The Medtronic has a lot of steps involved and a lot of things that can potentially go wrong. There's a lot of extra taping required. So, there's potential for issues with the sensor insertion. So proper training and practice is pretty important. Sensor sites are less of an issue than you might think. It's such a big deal with pumps. The infusion sites have to be managed so carefully. We don't really see too many issues with sensor sites, though. The placement is not that critical. As long as that sensor gets into a layer of fat under the skin, it should work pretty well. It doesn't matter what part of the body. It doesn't matter if there's a scar tissue or lipohypertrophy there. They still seem to work pretty well.
Is that because it's just reading and not, sending out insulin? Or is it just the wire so thin?
Yeah.
Any ideas?
Yeah, there's no chemical being infused into the body. It has to be absorbed in a certain manner. It's just measuring the glucose concentration in that tissue.
Before we move on, though, let me just ask for the Medtronic users out there, can you give them one or two pieces of advice in terms of the taping? Are there any tricks of the trade that are easy, to share?
The more stable the sensor is, the better. So I hate to say the more tape, the better. But, make sure you use the over bandages to make sure that sensor is not moving around much. Another issue we often see is that if the transmitter and sensor sort of bend against each other, then the transmitter may start to lose connection periodically. So place it so that the sensor and transmitter are on a relatively flat linear surface. I know in the human body there's not a lot of flat linear surfaces. But, for example, if it's on if you have it on your arm, put it lengthwise, not sideways on the arm, or even if it's on your abdomen, put it on a flat area, not a curved area, if at all possible. Reuse of the sensors is another thing people often want to know about, and it really depends on the sensor algorithm. With the G6, the algorithm assumes that there is going to be some change in how the sensor functions every day. There's going to be what's called drift. So by the time you get to day 8, 9, and 10, it's interpreting the signal very differently than it did on day 1, 2, and 3. So the bottom line is if you try to reuse a Dexcom G6 sensor, there's a good chance the accuracy is going to suffer. Ironically, we saw the opposite with the G5, G4 sensors. They seem to perform better on the second week because I guess there was no warm-up period and the sensor's working pretty well right from the get-go. There's still that 2-hour warm-up, but the sensor's already been housed under the skin for quite a while. So people are usually able to get a couple of weeks out of those older model sensors. But with the G6 sensors, it's probably not a good idea to be reusing them beyond the 10 days.
We haven't talked much about Eversense, which is really up and coming. And my impression was that for this episode where we're talking about best practices and things that we as individuals can do to make these CGMs better, I was thinking, well, they implant that under the skin, so there's really not much you can do with it as a user. But there are a few things. Can you touch on those?
Yeah, it's a neat product, and I must admit I haven't used it personally. I'm scheduled to go into a clinic in Philadelphia in a couple of weeks and have mine inserted, so I will get a chance to try it firsthand. I've had a number of patients use it, though, so I've been able to kind of live vicariously through them and see how it functions. And they've all been very happy with it and pretty impressed. The insertion process, reportedly, and from the training I've received, is relatively minor. It's a pretty quick, simple thing. You barely feel anything when they place it. And once it's in the skin, that site heals up very quickly. Having it under the skin, it just eliminates issues. You don't have to worry about changing the sensor on a regular basis. Transmitter that sticks to the skin can be removed and set aside any time. So for example, if you have to go for an MRI, you don't have to take your sensor out. You just put the transmitter aside. any kind of physical activity where it can't be worn, you can just remove it temporarily. But a nice thing about the transmitter that works with the Eversense sensor is the transmitter itself can communicate with the user by vibrating. So if there is a low or there's a high, it will vibrate with a certain tone or certain frequency to let the user know there's a potential problem. So you can go out for let's say a run without your phone or receiver, and the transmitter that's taped to your skin will let you know if there are any issues. Otherwise, there's an app in your cell phone to present your data for you. The Eversense does require a couple of calibrations per day, and the current sensor is a 3-month model. They've already approved a 6-month version in Europe, and that sensor only requires 1 calibration per day. And they're looking at versions that require far fewer calibrations than even that. And the FDA seems to take longer than most European safety commissions do. So probably within the next few years, we'll see an Eversense that requires even less work on the patient's part.
Before I let you go, right before we started talking, I was looking up some articles that you've written, and I found one from 2007 when you were giving terrific advice about using CGM. And right, you laugh because it seems like it's such a different world. Looking back, it is pretty amazing how far we have come and where things are going. Can you share your perspective on that as someone who uses these and has lived with diabetes?
So the first CGM I wore was in 2003, and that was a mini-med system called the mini-med CGMs, and it was nothing more than a black box with a wire coming out of it that attached to your skin, and it had a very large sensor that went into the skin. Now, that thing was cumbersome, clunky. It didn't even give you data while you wore it, but it was really cool being able to download it and see what the glucose levels looked like all day and night. It wasn't terribly accurate, but at least seeing what the patterns were like was just fascinating. Now, not only can we see our data live, we can learn cause and effect relationships as they happen. We can trust these things. We can use them as a management tool on a minute-to-minute basis if we want. And like I said, if you're skilled at analyzing the data from them, you can learn so much and fine-tune your program. I wanted to mention, if anybody doesn't have a clinician that really understands these reports all that well, they can reach out to my team because we work with people all over the country and overseas by phone and by internet to analyze these types of things.
And Gary, let me just take that one step further. I was definitely going to link up, Integrated Diabetes Services. Do you work with people of all ages?
Yes.
Kids, adults, seniors?
Yes.
It's really important because not everybody does. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then let me also ask you to continue the thought about the accuracy of the CGMs, because of course the next step is the pumps and the closed systems that are going to be using that data. We really are almost there. I mean, it's incredible. When you talk about wearing that CGM 15 years ago, 16 years ago, we're really on the precipice of multiple systems. I assume you're excited and think they're going to be accurate. I hope.
Yeah, very excited. Personally, I am running this do-it-yourself loop app that takes, an old pump along with a new Dexcom G6 and runs it through an app on my phone, and the app controls my pump's insulin delivery. It's got its share of little technical glitches now and then, but overall, it helps me achieve the best control that I've had in 30 years.
Wow.
And it does it just by compensating for my own inequities. When I make mistakes on things or underdose, overdose, etc., it fixes it for me. Not immediately. It takes a little time, but it does compensates for things that I don't get exactly right. So it's like having another brain watching over things for me and helping take care of.
That's fantastic. Gosh. Well, I can't wait. It's a lot of great stuff that's coming. It's a lot of great information here. Gary, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. Again, all the information about Gary and his amazing team will be at diabetes-connections.com if you want to contact them for a consult or more information. And of course, the book, Think Like a Pancreas, new edition coming out later this year. Maybe we'll come back on and talk to you more about that, or at the very least, give the information to my listeners. But Gary, thank you so much.
Stacey, it was my pleasure.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More links and information about CGM and the systems we talked about, just go to diabetes-connections.com or in the show notes on any podcast player. Every one of them is a little bit different, but they all have this little details or more info. And hopefully you can click on that and find the links, but they're always at the homepage. And I'll link up information about Gary as well. I think this is such a valuable service, and I've recommended it to a lot of adults with type 1 who, may be referred to their general practitioner instead of an endocrinologist for many reasons. Often there just isn't an endo in their area, which is, it's hard to believe, but it's happening all over the country. So Gary Scheiner and his team do remote consults. It's really a great service, and I will link up integrative diabetes services in the show notes as well. And if you're wondering what is in the longer episode, it's really just more in depth on a lot of these issues. We talk a little bit more about athletes and sports and CGM. We talk about the arrows. He goes more in depth on those arrows and how they're not consistent brand to brand, but, really more of a deep dive into what they mean, how to interpret them. And he will tell you the formula for getting your A1C from the CGM, because even though many of them will predict it, he's got a multiplication formula that will help you beat your endo. He wants you to make a bet. It's very cute. It's a joke. He's not serious, but there's a little bit more of information about how to predict your A1C from your CGM. So that's the bonus episode in just a couple of days. Time for our community connection, brought to you by Tandem. And you've heard me rave about the t:slim X2 insulin pump with the basal IQ technology from Tandem Diabetes Care. I'm not alone in that. The results of a 2018 clinical study known as the Prologue trial showed 91% of study participants said the basal IQ feature on the t:slim X2 pump was easy to use. And we agree. We are thrilled with it. Benny loves that it looks modern. It's not like the clunky brick he used to use. And I love that he finds it easy. Find out more about Benny's pump at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Tandem logo. One of the nicest trends I think that I've seen in the last few years in the diabetes community is more and more activities for adults with type 1. Because why should the kids have all the fun? So I want to talk to you just a little bit in the Community Connection this week about diabetes camps for grownups. There's only a couple of programs that I know of right now, and I'll be honest with you, I'm soliciting more because I want to make a list, and I want to make sure that we all know what's out there so that if you're an adult with type 1 and you went to camp as a kid and loved it, or you're an adult and you were diagnosed as an adult, or even if you're not and you missed camp for some reason when you were a kid, that you have this experience. And some of these are, you go live in a cabin and there's a campfire and guitars and, it's really traditional. And some of these are very active and for athletes or for a time when you want to maybe push yourself. And some of them I think are just more vacation-y retreats, which would be my cup of tea because I went to camp for 8 years as a kid and I loved it, but I don't think I'm the cabin type of person anymore. So just a couple of quick examples. And we've had the folks from Camp Nejeda on. They do a camp for adults. Camp Nejeda is up in New Jersey. They actually have their adult program this coming weekend, the last weekend in May. So unfortunately, I think it may be too late. If you're hearing this for the first time, I will link up the information. It's worth reaching out. You never know. But that's coming up really, really quickly. But at least to know for next year or to follow up with them, because I think they have programming for adults throughout the year, even though it may not be an overnight. Beyond Type 1 and Connected in Motion have teamed up for their Slipstream events. There are a handful of these, I think 4 or 5, in different locations. The first one is coming up again this weekend. It's in Maine. So definitely follow up with them on that. But there are several more: Ontario, Southern California, Colorado. And if I know Beyond Type 1, they'll be adding more, but check it out and get involved. And then Take Control of Your Diabetes just went to their great conference. They do a summer retreat for people with type 1 in August. It's called One, the Ultimate Conference and Retreat, and it is in San Diego. And while TCOYD does programming for adults with type 1 and type 2, this conference in August is for people with type 1. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you know of an adult program, let me know. I'd love to make a list and let people know about this because I just think this is one of the greatest things that you can do. If you're listening and you're thinking, that sounds lame, I don't want to sing Kumbaya and sit around with other people with type 1, you don't go to conferences, or you think, look, I probably cannot convince you, but I will link up to other episodes we've done with people with type 1, because I don't have type 1, as you know, that have said this is life-changing. I guess you have to experience it for yourself. So I would urge you to learn more. Look in your own community because camp is life-changing for kids. So why shouldn't it be for adults, right? We all need to find our community. I want to do a camp for moms, right? For diabetes moms. Let's go to camp. Although I would call it, camp in quotes. Can you see me doing the air quotes? Camp for moms would be like, set me by the pool and bring me my drink and don't give me my Dexcom share for the week. All right. If you want to start a program like that, I am in. Time for Tell Me Something Good, and that is brought to you by Real Good Foods. They have so many great new products out right now. They have an Italian food line. They have breakfast sandwiches. But I'll tell you, I really think that the cauliflower crust pizza is going to be a staple in our house for a long time to come. I really like them. They have a family size one. They have these personal pizzas that have a different crust. They're just really tasty, and you can get them in the grocery store, which is a huge plus. Now, you can get mixed packs at realgoodfoods.com. They have all the inventory on the website. And so if you want to mix and match and sample, the website's probably the way to go. But, if you shop at Walmart, Harris Teeter, Publix, they're available in more and more places. And it's awesome just to grab one from your grocery freezer. Low carb, delicious, nice to have something that the kids like to eat that we know isn't going to spike Benny's blood sugar. Find out more at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Real Good Foods logo. All right, tell me something good. This is my favorite part of the show. This is where I talk about awards or accolades or just good stuff from our community. So this first one features a young woman who is not type 1. She does not live with diabetes, but she has a friend who does. I talked to Ariel Flur's father, back in the spring of 2016. Because her dad decided to participate in the Tour de Cure, the ADA's big bike ride, because his daughter's best friend has T1D, and his daughter wanted her friend to have a sleepover. And they weren't really sure what to do, so the whole family got educated about type 1. This was a couple of years ago, and then their involvement just took off from there. But the reason I'm featuring Ariel Flur here is because we had our local theater awards for high school students. The Blumenthal Performing Arts Center is the big arts center here in Charlotte, and the Blumey Awards are for the best high school student performers in the area, and these are huge. This is a huge area. This is a metropolitan area, more than 1 million people in the Charlotte area, so it's a big deal. And Ariel won Best Actress for 2019 for her performance as Mary Poppins. So congratulations to her. If I can find the clip, I will link that up, but more info about her big win. It's really great stuff. And I'll also link up the episode. It was episode 47 way back in 2016 where I talked to her dad, Peter. And it's also the same episode where we first talked to Howard Look of Tide Pool. So if you want to go in the Wayback Machine, it doesn't seem that long ago, but it was before a lot of the tech stuff had happened in this space. So that's going to be an interesting episode to listen to. So congratulations, Ariel. That's awesome. I also want to mention so many great listeners that I spoke to at the Touched by Type 1 conference. First on the list is Jason Pike. Jason is a longtime listener who doesn't have Facebook, so he's not in our Facebook group, so I couldn't give him a shout there. But Jason, thank you so much for coming, for letting me meet your family, for letting us take pictures and just have so much fun. I posted the pictures on Instagram. Do you have Instagram? And I also on social media on Facebook, but I don't know if you saw them. But Jason, thank you for listening. Thanks for coming. Please keep in touch. I met Christina Martin, who was just a joy to talk to. We had so much fun, and everybody met my mom. My mom was there too. But Christina Martin is going to be on this season of American Ninja Warrior along with Colt Scott. And I was making fun of her online afterward because she didn't say anything about that. I knew that there was another person on American Ninja Warrior with type 1 this season, but it just, I wasn't putting two and two together. I was joking she should wear a hat or carry a sign that just says Ninja wherever she goes until the show airs. So it was awesome to meet her. And I'm so embarrassed. There's another wonderful woman I met who didn't have a name tag on. I realized after you left, I didn't get your name. And she is a longtime listener. She lives in the Orlando area, and she came to the conference because she saw that I was speaking. And that was just wonderful. So I'm mortified. I'm bringing it up because you know me. I'll just say what's true. If you're listening, if this is you, you were wearing a gray and white striped shirt. I posted a picture of us together. I'll put it in the Facebook group. Please let me know your name. I would love to give you a shout out or just stay in touch because it was wonderful to meet you. And I'm a big dummy who didn't get your name. But I also wanted to give a big shout out to a guy named Jim Kutudis. Now, Jim was in my session on making diabetes connections, where I talk about how you make real life connections so it's not all on the internet, right? Internet is great. Podcasts are great. You need that real life connection. I do a whole presentation on it. So during the presentation, I talked about camp, and I mentioned Camp Nejeda, which I talked about at the beginning. It comes up a lot on this show. But my cousin, who is now, 16, has type 1, and he goes to, that's his camp. That's his diabetes camp. So Jim kind of raised his hand a little bit, or gave a little cheer when I said Nejeda. And then he came over and explained that that's where he went as a kid. And he also mentioned that some of his best friends, or his family's best friends, have been made because his wife approached the mom of a child. The child had an Omnipod, and Jim's daughter has type 1 as well. And she noticed the Omnipod, and now the girls are really great friends. But it gets better. He sent pictures of him at camp when he was a little boy. So I'm going to post those in the Facebook group too. Jim, thank you so much for saying something, for sending those pictures, for sharing your experience. I mean, I tell you, camp makes a big difference. Believe me, it really does when you have those great memories years and years later. And Camp Nejeda, if you're listening, you need to have Jim back. I mean, do a reunion or something. I just think that's great stuff. All right, you got something good for me? Send it over. It can be awards, accolades, somebody changed a site, somebody said something funny, whatever you want. We have a lot of stress in our community. We have a lot of fear. We got yucky stuff. Tell me something good. Next stop for us, diabetes-wise or conference-wise, is actually Diabetes Camp. When I'm dropping Benny off, Camp has asked me to do some interviews. We shall see how it goes. I can't imagine anything more chaotic than trying to do podcast interviews at camp drop-off. But hey, we're game. We'll give it a try. We'll let you know how that goes. It'll be fun to see what the kids have to say. And then after that, the next conference on my schedule is Friends for Life back in Orlando in July. We are going to do our game show there again. And you, as you listen, can participate. I will be putting information out about that in the Facebook group. So join Diabetes Connections, the group. You have to be in the group to play because otherwise it just gets too complicated. So we'll put that info in there probably mid-June, I would say, about a month before the Friends for Life conference. And I'll have a booth at the conference for the first time this year. So if you are going, that's an easier way to find me. And I'm really excited about that. Some more announcements upcoming this summer, so stay tuned. In the meantime, thank you so much to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you for all you do. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.